To think it all started in 2013 with Vladimir Putin's Russia pressuring Ukraine's then pro-Moscow president to walk away from a trade partnership with Brussels. 8 years, one revolution, two invasions later, the European Union now set to offer Kyiv and neighboring Moldova a path to EU candidate status. Actual membership, well, that's a long way off. So what does the move by a summit of the 27 in Brussels mean? And what further backlash? Putin may have assured investors in St. Petersburg last week that he sees no objection to Ukraine joining the EU. His track record suggests otherwise. Does the bloc, for instance, have the resolve to weather the prospect of Russia cutting all natural gas exports? Resolve? Well, that requires leadership. We'll ask our panel about the recently re-elected Emmanuel Macron losing his outright majority in last Sunday's legislative elections. Can he still aspire to the unofficial title of King of Europe, left vacant by the now retired Angela Merkel of Germany? What's standing for France in the throes of domestic uncertainty? What about the continent's other big guns in the face of a war at its border that's coupled with an energy crisis and skyrocketing inflation? Today in the France 24 debate, can a united EU bite the bullet in the face of Russia's invasion of Ukraine? Joining us is Jacques Krupnik, Director of Research at the French Political Science Institute, Sciences Po. Thanks for being with us. With us from Maribor, Slovenia, Sophie Pornschläger, Senior Policy Analyst at the European Policy Center think tank. Thanks for being with us.
Thank you.
Brussels correspondent Dave Keating is watching the latest from that summit. How are you, Dave?
Doing all right.
And from Kyiv, we welcome Inna Sovsun, a Ukrainian member of parliament from the Halos party. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you for having me. Thanks.
The France 24 debate, where you can join the conversation on Facebook and Twitter, hashtag F24debate. Russia's invasion of Ukraine certainly fast-forwarding that candidate status for both Ukraine and neighboring former Soviet state Moldova. Karis Garland has more.
Opening the door to Ukraine's future in the EU, all 27 of the bloc's leaders are set to grant the country candidate status in Brussels Thursday, a move welcomed by EU Council President Charles Michel.
This is a decisive moment for the European Union. It's also a geopolitical choice that we will make today, and I'm confident that today we will grant the candidate status to Ukraine and to Moldova.
On Wednesday, Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky said he had continued a telephone marathon to help secure candidacy status, speaking with 11 EU leaders throughout the day. Albania, though, has warned Kyiv against any unreasonable hopes for a speedy process.
North Macedonia is candidate since 17 years, if I have not lost the count. Albania since 8. So welcome to Ukraine. It's a good thing to give candidate status, but I hope the Ukrainian people will not make many illusions about it.
4 Western Balkans countries are deeply frustrated about their stalled bids to join the EU, and 3 of them had threatened to boycott the meeting in protest. Bloc membership comes with a long list of conditions. For Ukraine, that will mean carrying out judicial and business reforms and stamping out corruption, tasks unlikely to be completed while the country is at war.
Ukraine is Europe!
The decision to grant Ukraine candidacy status highlights a sense of urgency to support Kyiv in its struggle against Russia's invasion, as well as the desire to send Moscow a clear message about European solidarity.
So, Dave Keating, listening to the Albanian leader there, it's clear that candidacy status doesn't mean you're a member of the European Union.
That's for sure. Just ask Turkey, which was given candidate status over 2 decades ago. And today, most people don't think Turkey will ever be a member of the European Union. So it certainly doesn't guarantee it. That being said, this was not a decision taken lightly. And over the past weeks, I've heard from a lot of mostly Western European diplomats expressing concern about giving candidacy status simply for geopolitical signaling reasons. This was a big concern because a lot of people feel that the EU was pressured into giving Turkey candidate status in the late 1990s, pressured by London, by Washington, in order to keep Turkey on side with the West. They say not only did that not work, but now they're kind of stuck with this zombie candidate status where there's absolutely no movement on it, no one expects it to lead to EU membership, and yet they can't close it for fear of the geopolitical pushback. Ukraine is, of course, a very different situation than Turkey, but they really didn't want to give candidate status as just some kind of signal with no real intent to have Ukraine join the EU. The sea change came just last week when the leaders of Germany and France and Italy, during a visit to Kyiv, endorsed immediate candidate status for Ukraine. Germany and France had been opposing it up until then, and we saw after that all the Western European countries that have been reticent about this really fell into line. The question is, do they view this as a real accession, or is this meant as signaling both to Ukraine to show them EU support, but also to Russia to show that the EU is in this for the long haul, and the EU does not agree with Moscow's position that Ukraine naturally falls into the Russian orbit?
Sophie Pornschlager, is this a symbol or is this for real?
I would say that it is rather symbolic, I have to say. I think Dave Keaton just said it very rightly, that there are geopolitical considerations and then there's institutional considerations. A lot of EU leaders already said that it would be a very long process. Granting candidate status does not mean that the negotiations are starting automatically, and it also doesn't mean that the Ukraine is going to join the EU anytime soon. Also bearing in mind it's a very large country, has problems with its territorial sovereignty at the moment, and also it's a country of 44 million people, which means it would be a very large country to join the EU. So I think for geopolitical reasons, it was a very important symbol in the short term to say that Ukraine is part of Europe and the European continent and is fighting for European values as well. It's another one to see then in the nitty-gritty in the next few years whether this will actually happen. Maybe one more point to say that it is also not the most useful, I would say, because it would have been more useful to give Ukraine more heavy weapons rather than give them a symbolic EU candidate status. But I guess there is the real politically sensitive issues at stake. So that's why it was more hard to discuss this rather than discuss the candidate status of Ukraine.
Is it the remit of the European Union to provide that heavy weaponry, or is that NATO's job, Sophie?
Excuse me, I'm in Slovenia at an NGO, so I was just in between. What did you say?
I said, is that the job of the EU? You mentioned the heavy weaponry that would have been, or is that the job just of NATO?
Well, that's a very difficult question. Obviously, defense and security is not in the hands of the EU, but rather the EU leaders. But you can see that countries like France and Germany are quite reluctant to send more heavy weaponry. And also, of course, it's the remit more of NATO. There, at the same time, you see that the US is supporting Ukraine quite a lot. But, it would be a bigger symbol if European countries, and especially Western European countries like Germany and France, would really support Ukraine with heavy weaponry. But there's a lot of domestic issues, as you can see in Germany, where you have also identity issues coming at stake, asking whether Germans are still pacifists if they send heavy weapons to Ukraine. So it's a longer discussion to have, which also includes more public debates. More public debates. So, Jacques Rupnik, does this moment matter?
It matters a great deal. I think this pouring cold water on a day of a major achievement for Ukraine in the EU is really unnecessary and inappropriate. This is a moment that the Ukrainians have been asking for. President Zelensky asked for candidate status in his speech to the European Parliament on the 1st of March. A week after the beginning of the war. He addressed the European Parliament and says, this is where we want to go. Well, in record time, the European Union has responded to that, united, not just in providing humanitarian aid, refugees, being taken care of, and supplying weapons, which is not the matter for the EU, but for individual countries and members of NATO. And I think that this is a very strong political message sent. Now, as has been said, it doesn't mean that overnight this changes Ukraine's status. Ukraine is a country at war. In normal times, you would not come anywhere near a candidate status for a country that is at war. First condition for joining the EU, you cannot have a country that doesn't control its territory. So that would be a sort of a non-starter. Despite of that, the EU twisted its own rules, so to speak, to go fast, to give a strong political message. Now, the big question, of course, after is, will it be capable of following it up? That will be the test question. And secondly, if you do that for Ukraine, if you show that very strong political commitment on Ukraine, you cannot leave the Balkans. Countries that have had their own wars in the 1990s, different kind of wars, but they had wars in the 1990s. And after those wars, they applied to the European Union, and they've been left sometimes 15, 20 years in the waiting room. So clearly, if the train of the enlargement starts moving for Ukraine, it has to be moving for the Balkans too.
Ines Sofsun, listening to Jacques Rupnik, what do you take away? How much does this moment matter today?
Well, I understand that to a very big extent it is a symbolic move. But I will tell you this is the move that literally the whole country is waiting. I'm seeing that on the social media. Everybody is posting today, saying that we are waiting for the final decision. It's extremely important for our guys and girls on the front, because they need to know what they're fighting for, that there will be a perspective for Ukraine after all this terrible war is over. So this is extremely important for Ukrainians, and that I can tell you for sure. On a symbolic level, but then also there is, of course, geopolitical importance to that. Because might I remind you that now we have to say a very strong message to Putin, saying that this is where Ukraine belongs, this is where Ukraine is welcome, and he has no right to claim Ukraine as part of his terrain, whatever that means for him. So I think that is also important on the geopolitical terms, not just as keeping up the spirits of the Ukrainians, but also geopolitically. Because again, might I remind you that before, Putin was saying that he has no problem with Ukraine joining European Union. But about 2 months ago, after it started moving, he actually changed his position. And there was a different statement by his government saying that, well, we changed our position and now we do have problems with Ukraine in joining European Union, because it is a problem for him right now. And that means that this is the right move for Ukraine. And then there is a very personal comment on my side. I want to make sure that there is a somewhere point in time in the future where I will foresee my son having a Ukrainian citizenship and a citizenship of European Union. That is what we are fighting for, after all, for the future for us and for the future of our children. And that is why this move, again, no matter how symbolic it is at this point, is so very important for all of us. And that is why we are following the news very, very closely right now to get to know what the final decision will be.
Yeah, you mentioned there the changing pronouncements of Vladimir Putin. Last Friday, he effectively said, Ukraine and the EU, no biggie. This was in St. Petersburg before foreign investors.
Well, I think that was...
The EU is not a military organization, military political bloc, unlike us. Therefore, we always say that our stance is coherent, understandable. We have nothing against it. It is a sovereign decision of any country to join or not to join economic unions, and the decision of those economic organizations to accept members or not.
Ines Sofsun, what was your reaction when you heard that last Friday?
Well, I think that was him trying to sell this to his own people. him trying to explain that this is no biggie, that nothing big is going to change because of that. Because again, their position has been shifting, and I think they were trying to prevent Ukraine moving forward with the European Union. But now, when it became inevitable after Presidents Macron, Prime Minister Draghi, and Chancellor Scholz announced basically that they will support the candidacy for Ukraine, I think he had to explain that to his own people, that this is not changing anything. Well, of course, his hypocrisy on saying that this is a sovereign decision by a sovereign state is enormous, given the fact that he annexed 20% of this sovereign state and is trying to influence the regime change, as he was claiming at the beginning of this full-scale invasion. So that is as hypocritical as Putin gets. But I'm absolutely sure that this is him selling this to his own audience, knowing that this is a geopolitical loss for him, and he had to frame it somehow nicely for the Russian people.
All right, so the gauntlet thrown down to Moscow, and it's already been thrown down since February with the ratcheting up of sanctions. Lithuania's application of those EU sanctions exposing that Baltic state to the wrath of Moscow after its ban Monday on the transit of steel and other ferrous metals to neighboring Kaliningrad. Moscow forced to reroute shipments by sea. Kaliningrad, a Russian exclave that's nestled there between Lithuania and Poland. The Russians warning there will be consequences.
This example shows that you cannot trust either verbal or written statements by the West. Russia will certainly respond to such hostile actions. Appropriate measures are being worked out between departments and will be taken in the near future. Their consequences will have a serious negative impact on the population of Lithuania.
Jacques Rupnik, the EU is going to have to show solidarity with the likes of Lithuania.
Certainly. This issue of Kaliningrad is very important, because next to Kaliningrad you have this corridor on the border of Lithuania and Poland to Belarus, and this is potentially a conflict zone. The Lithuanian took a very strong decision. Russians are responding. We shall see how far it goes. But the European Union, of course, is backing the Lithuanian as far as they are observing the European sanctions policy. This is a common policy that has been decided. But clearly there are security risks involved.
And who is security risks? So whose job is it to stand by Lithuania? Again, is it the EU or is it NATO?
Well, it's both. It's most of EU members are members of NATO. So if you ask individual countries, so it's not EU policy as such to be there to defend them, but it is the policy of NATO, which is very much present in Lithuania. I hope we are not there yet, but clearly this shows that potential for conflict and conflict extension is there, and this is what we were worried from the beginning.
All right, the EU is going to have to show solidarity with Lithuania and stock up on fuel for the winter. Russia's reductions in natural gas exports could quickly become a blanket embargo. The Germans this Thursday raising their alert level, and the Commission's first Vice President, Franz Timmermans, briefing the European Parliament on what Putin's threats mean for the entire bloc.
Member states have reiterated their commitment to the energy efficiency first principle. So the regulation is based on a fair and balanced burden sharing mechanism. He will not be able to divide us.
We won't let it divide us. Dave Keating, though, does the EU speak as one when it comes to what the Germans are calling energy blackmail?
Well, I mean, we did have the oil embargo problem where Hungary held out its veto until the other EU countries agreed to this compromise that exempts Hungarian oil, or exempts Russian oil going to Hungary and neighbors Czechia and Slovakia. That didn't look very unified. It does only exempt 10% of Russian oil, but still it's that message that it sent. And you were talking about the Kaliningrad question, which they will be discussing here at this summit tonight. That has a lot of people very, very worried in terms of how Russia may respond to its allegations of a blockade of Kaliningrad. The EU insists there is no blockade. This is just a byproduct of the sanctions because those Russian goods have to go through EU territory. But I think that tonight, the energy issue isn't officially on the agenda, but I'm told by every diplomat, yeah, for sure, they're going to talk about it because they're really worried. Again, tonight, this idea of capping oil prices is going to come up. Spain is going to push this issue again. They're going to be trying to find solutions. And even right now, they're actually getting pressure from Washington to dilute the oil embargo that they agreed just a few weeks ago, because that embargo, in addition to banning 90% of Russian oil coming into the EU, it also bans European companies from providing insurance to tankers that are bringing Russian oil to other non-EU countries. And the immediate effect in global oil prices really spooked the Biden administration. There have been reports over the last week that both the US and Canada are saying maybe just a cap on the insurance so that you could still be a European company insuring these tankers. Otherwise, if you remove all the Russian oil from the market, you could have huge price effects. So that's the context in all of this. You might want to act strongly against Russia and do like the strongest possible thing, but then the backlash effects on the market could actually hurt you more. And now even Washington, which has been pretty hawkish on these things, usually calling on the EU to do the strongest possible thing, even Washington right now is asking for the EU to back off on the oil sanctions that they already agreed.
Sophie Punschlegel, do you weigh the consequences on livelihoods, or do you stand firm and say what's happening right now in Ukraine is a threat for all of Europe and therefore there's a price to pay?
I mean, when you decide on sanction packages like the EU did, you clearly agree to pay a price. And I think that was pretty clear. What we saw, though, is that you increasingly have countries like Hungary blackmailing others and making it harder to have a unified position. EU leaders, on top of that, have a very difficult position to be in because not only do they have to deal with energy prices, that problem, but also there's still climate targets to reach. I mean, the EU decided they want to be climate neutral until 2050. And I see that now with the war in Ukraine, we're talking about LNG terminals, about nuclear power, which I think is not very carbon intensive, but still there's a lot of factors to bring into that. And I think that going forward, it won't be easier for EU leaders to have a unified position on that, especially as countries like Germany are extremely dependent on Russian gas because of strategic mistakes they did in the past.
And those strategic mistakes, let's talk about them for a second, because we did hear a bit of wavering from one aide to the German chancellor, who talked again earlier this week at a conference about the prospect of what do you do, how do you handle Russia in the long term, to cut short criticism of those remarks by that senior aide. The German chancellor clearing the air before the Bundestag, the German parliament.
Let's be clear. A partnership with Russia, which was the goal of the 2010 strategic concept, is unimaginable in the foreseeable future with Putin's aggressive, imperialist Russia.
Before the German parliament, and I'll put it to you, Sophie Punschlegel, Olaf Scholz saying that there would be, at this point in time, let me look up the words exactly that he used, a partnership with Russia is unimaginable in the foreseeable future with Putin's aggressive imperialist Russia. The words he used on the eve of this summit, does it reflect public opinion back home?
So what you can see in Germany is that most of them are supportive of Ukraine. I think the big issue with Germany, and also what you could see a little bit with France, is that, of course, we are faced with a huge neighbor, which is Russia, where we don't know in which direction they're going to move. So there are also geopolitical implications to that, to say we need to manage this threat. As such, especially Germany will have an issue with its Russia policy. I think you have to have internal changes, especially with the Social Democrats that had a huge Russian part. And also the whole approach of transformation through trade, so Wandel durch Handel, which means that it's a huge rethinking of the entire Russia policy and also the energy policy. And there, I can understand that sometimes it takes time, but I think the words of Olaf Scholz really shows what he thinks about Russia at the moment and the unlawful aggression of Ukraine that happened on the 24th of February.
Ina Sofsun, at the outset of our conversation, you heard our Brussels correspondent, Dave Keating, mention how that trip we saw last week by the leaders of France, Germany, and Italy steeled their resolve. Your thoughts now?
Well, we are happy to see the change in the rhetoric. Clear change in rhetoric, particularly by Chancellor Scholz, because he was rather, let's say, reserved in his emotions and policies regarding Ukraine. Right now, we are seeing that the Germany policy is actually changing. There are more specific and detailed debates about the weapons supply from Germany to Ukraine. We do hope it will be delivered. We actually did receive some of the German weapons right now, and then Ukrainian army has started using them already. There is debate about them providing us with the air defense system. Unfortunately, they are not promising it will come soon, but still it's a progress. So there is clearly a progress from the German side. The French have been, truth be told, rather supportive to begin with. We understand President Macron was in a situation of elections, and that was limiting his probably potential for speaking up on this issue. But we do see a clear progress. What we understand also is that this progress in speaking in favor of Ukraine, in support of Ukraine, will be very much challenged with the winter coming. And here I have to be honest with you. Speaking as a Ukrainian, we know how Russians behave. They hit you when you are the weakest, when they see that you are divided. They hit you when they see that you are having challenges ahead of you. And when they will see that you are lacking gas, they will cut off the supplies altogether. That is their policy. That is something that they have been doing to Ukraine for years. That is why our reliance on Russian gas specifically was stopped in 2014. But for instance, we have been still relying on the supplies of coal, very small, but still important for us up until last year. And then when we didn't have our own reserves last year in the beginning of winter, they cut off their supplies because they knew that that would be extremely damaging to us. So I have to be absolutely honest with you. I think European Union need to understand that this is Putin's thinking. This is his policy. This is his politics, after all, and he will do this. And I think here, European Union needs to not to hope that he will, reconsider and behave like a normal human being, but he will hit you when you are weak and when you are not united and when you have challenges ahead of you. And I think as hard as it is, European Union and Ukraine need to prepare for, the worst case scenario where Russia will cut off all the gas supplies to Europe, and there needs to be a plan B, both for Ukraine and European Union, because I have no doubt that this is where Putin will be going with this.
Dave Keating, you said earlier that natural gas is officially not on the agenda of this summit, but the words of Ina Sofsun are being discussed by the leaders.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, tomorrow they're going to be continuing talks. Tonight is really the intense talks. Once they get, I should note that this decision about Ukraine's candidacy is very delayed. We were supposed to get this hours ago, so I'm not exactly sure what the holdup is there. But there's a lot to talk about, right? And energy and this potential brinksmanship that could come with the gas in the coming months are very much on the agenda. This is the last time that the EU leaders will meet until the autumn. These summits are held 4 times a year, unless there's an emergency summit called in the next 2 months for some reason. This is the last chance they have to prepare themselves for what people are saying could be a very destabilizing autumn and winter. There are a lot of dire predictions we're hearing here in Brussels about rolling blackouts, about certain industry having to not turn on their factories on certain days. And I think these are the kind of sobering conversations they're going to be having on the sidelines tonight and tomorrow.
Yeah, last Brussels summit, by the way, before France hands over the rotating presidency of the European Council to the Czechs. Emmanuel Macron, as Ina Sovsun was saying earlier, will have wielded the gavel during his successful run for re-election back in April. That's unprecedented. But last week's optics of a president of Europe flanked by the leaders of Germany and Italy en route to Kyiv will not have been enough to convince voters back home. In a national address on the eve of this summit, Macron trying his best to accentuate the positive.
The legislative elections have made the presidential majority the largest political group in the National Assembly. However, this is a new fact, and as in most Western democracies, whether it's in Germany, Italy, or many others, no political force today can make the laws alone.
Okay, so he's got the largest parties, but he's 60 seats short of a majority, which he has no path to a majority right now. Your reaction when you hear Emmanuel Macron talking about coalition politics and referring to other European nations?
Well, this is democracy. In democracy, you have an election. Sometimes you don't get a majority, and you have to talk to other parties and build coalitions. Germany has coalition. Most European countries have coalition governments. Italy has a government made up of all parties on the political spectrum. So France is learning the hard way that sometimes the president, who was a winner of the presidential election, will have to make compromises on specific issues with the parliament. But it's a democracy lesson if one needed one. Indeed, it is a useful lesson for those who are the candidates to join the European Union, because you've shown President Macron in the train for Kiev. That's okay. That's a great picture for people like myself who believe in the expansion of the European Union. That's great. But for most voters, they are concerned about inflation at 10%, energy prices going up. What is it going to do to the economy, etc.? So, you implement sanctions and you hope it's going to hurt Russia so that it diminishes its capacity to pursue war. But of course, sanctions also hit those who implement them, and so we will see. The question for democracies is: do they have the staying power? For something like that, the staying power, you implement sanctions, and then you have to think about the social, economic consequences of all that. And they are international, and they hit Europe in particular. So, this is where democracies, the European Union, will have to show a lot of resolve, political cohesion, and simply saying, we have to do this and that because there is an outside threat. Yes, it's convincing for most people, but for those who are, let's say, in the worst hit by this, by the consequences, this is not always an obvious proposition.
Okay, but Jack, you know that there's a pecking order in Europe, right? And yes, we have institutions at the European level, but we also have the de facto power. There was a front cover of The Economist magazine a few years back, which described Germany as the reluctant hegemon. And Angela Merkel was clearly the leader of Germany of Europe when she was chancellor for many. Emmanuel Macron trying to fill that role during this 6-month rotating presidency of the European Council. What's France's status on the European stage, and does a weakened France have implications when it comes to that war in Ukraine?
I don't think so. Obviously, it weakens temporarily the president. He has to readjust. It's much easier if you have the majority in parliament. Everything is much smoother. So you have to spend a lot of more time bargaining, negotiating. This is politics. But I don't think it weakens the status. And, Angela Merkel perhaps was a leader, but she also was largely responsible for the energy dependency we have on Russia. So, it's not enough to be proclaimed a leader. I think there is a France and Germany, this tandem, much derided, always said, too strong. The real hegemon is this Franco-German tandem, if you're really looking for this word. That is, let me put it this way. There is no major decision in the EU without these two. But it's not enough for these two countries. to take a decision to be accepted and implemented by the others. So it works that way. And even at the European level, Macron and the German Chancellor will have to try together make unity, because we've seen cracks in that unified posture. Even on the war in Ukraine, we've seen countries such as Poland, etc., taking a very radical, tough posture, much closer, let's say, to Britain, but welcoming, calling for Kyiv to be in the EU, but at the same time describing the EU as a terrible plot to deprive Poland of its sovereignty. Polish Minister of Justice 6 months ago described the EU as something like the Soviet Union. Brussels is the new Moscow. Well, if you believe that, why would you want Kyiv, your best friend, to be joining this terrible European machine? So we have divisions inside Europe. This is what makes sometimes our decision-making difficult. But we have shown remarkable unity, despite all the criticism, in facing this Ukrainian challenge. And the 6th round of sanctions we've had, yeah, that's a major achievement of the French presidency, if nothing else.
Sophie Barnschlegel, you outlined in great detail Germany's nuances when it comes to the war in Ukraine. Listening to Jacques Rupnik describe Europe as not having a king, but rather co-princes, you might say, the German Chancellor and the French President. Is the leadership strong enough for this crisis?
I think we could be in a worse situation, let's put it that way. I think with Italy, France, and Germany having all leaders that are clearly not on the far right, yes, they have domestic issues. Yes, the legislative elections in France means more bargaining at EU, at domestic level. But they're very pro-European, and they know that it's important to stay together to also face Russia. So I think we're in a good position. The question I would put forward is, are they ambitious enough? Being united is good, but I would say it's not enough, and they need to be more ambitious, especially if you look at what price we pay for this unity. I work on rule of law, and I have to say that looking at Poland, they clearly have not been safeguarding European values by giving the recovery plan to Poland without any conditionalities on the independence of the judiciary. So it's also, of course, trade-offs, but when the trade-offs are European values and values like democracy, I think we're not going in the right direction. So I would criticize them there. Also, when it comes to the Franco-German tandem, I have to say that Germany has been very much following the status quo. What you can see is that Chancellor Scholz is following Merkel's line in, not preparing any big visions for the EU. Macron has been much more active. And in Brussels, you discuss stuff like the European political community, strategic sovereignty, industrial policy, and those are very much French ideas. So I think there we can really say that France has been doing a good job in trying to bring forward some new concepts as well and moving forward on very important topics.
Dave Keating, what's the vibe like after last Sunday's legislative elections, which I should say mean that roughly between 30 and 40% of France's parliament now is either critical in parts of EU policy or outright Eurosceptic?
I mean, Emmanuel Macron is right to say this is a situation that's completely normal in other countries. In fact, many of the other prime ministers sitting around that table upstairs would be thrilled to have the kind of proportion that Macron has in the French parliament. And we should remember that in the previous election in Germany, the AfD, the far-right AfD, was the largest opposition party there. So this is a completely normal situation for European countries. But as we say here in Brussels, c'est la France. It's different. France is a different country, and everyone knows that. So when Macron comes here, having received this rebuke on Sunday, it kind of doesn't matter if this is a normal situation in other European countries, because the situation in France is different, and people are used to the French president controlling the French parliament. That's how it usually is. So certainly you could feel the vibe here. And just one concrete example, last month when the Conference on the Future of Europe gave its recommendations in Strasbourg, this citizens initiative where they recommended treaty changes to reform the EU, President Macron said he would come to this summit with ideas and a proposal to have a convention for treaty change in the EU. That's been dropped. There is no talk about that at this summit. And indeed, when I talked to European diplomats, they said, look, after Sunday. We think this is dead for right now. So certainly the perception here in Brussels is that Macron has lost his mojo, but who could replace him? He is really still the de facto leader of Europe because there is still no other clear candidate to replace his leadership position among the EU 27 leaders. It's certainly not German Chancellor Olaf Scholz.
Ines Sofsun, it's messy, huh? 27 countries, each with their own parliamentary system. Again, you need strong backing. Is it strong enough? Is this the best that's possible?
Well, it is the best of the options that we have. I'll tell you this. We do not really have much of a choice because we can either go to Russia or we can go to the European Union. The choice is very, very clear. And right now, more than 80% of Ukrainians are willing for us to join the European Union and NATO, which actually is something new because the support for NATO membership, for instance, has been much lower up until February 24th, and then things rapidly changed. So we understand the complexities, trust me. We also understand that for us, that will be a big challenge to actually join in, to actually ensure that we fulfill the criteria, that we meet all the necessary criteria regarding the rule of law, fighting corruption, many more reforms in economic sector, and so on and so forth. But truth be told, when you are in a war situation, things get much more black and white. And I understand that you have the luxury to debate different shades of gray, but for us, it's not really an option. It's not really a decision. It's not really a debate, because for us, the situation is extremely black and white. And for us, it's really a matter of life and death. That is why, again, no matter how complex the situation in the European Union is, and I do actually support the ideas that the European Union institutions need to be reformed in order to be able to enlarge, to have more members, which is an inevitable process. I do believe that there needs to be decisions how to deal, for instance, with countries like Hungary, which are clearly not moving into the same direction of democratization, of support for human rights and so on and so forth. There needs to be decisions about that. But again, when you are going to the funerals of military men and women killed by Russians, that makes the situation pretty black and white. And that is why we are so keen on joining in and willing to do as much as possible, understanding that, again, that will take time for us.
Jacques Rupnik, you were saying earlier in the conversation, next fall, it could become black and white for the French if they start to see power cuts and the like when they look at their home heating bills. How do you feel the resolve is?
I think that much will depend on the capacity of political leaders in France, but in the rest of Europe, to convey where the priorities are. It may be tough, it may be difficult. Yes, there is inflation, the prices of energy go up, etc. But look what's happening in Ukraine. Look at the kind of issues there. These are, war and peace issues. This is a matter of European security. So I think this will require strong leadership. It will also require a lot of persuasion, because one thing is to say, Ukraine has candidate status. We want Ukraine in the EU. Then we've just heard, and rightly so, that Ukraine understands that it's a difficult organization. 27 members. There are the countries of the Balkans who are also waiting in the queue to get in. So the main thing to explain will be, you think it's difficult at 27, and now you tell us it's going to be better at 37? Wow.
So you like Emmanuel Macron's idea of a EU light alongside the EU?
Well, you create a framework which ties these countries to Europe, but not as a substitute. Not as a substitute for enlargement of the European Union, but as a framework within which they can access. Some will go faster than others. If Ukraine is able to do it in a few years, well, good luck. I very much hope so. And so will the countries from the Balkans. The important thing for the EU, it will have to change its own modus operandi, its own rules. You will have to change the decision-making mechanism. You cannot rely on a situation where one country will have a veto. Suddenly Estonia, Macedonia, and somebody will cast a veto on what 30 other countries have decided. This is a non-starter. So you have to change. There will have to be more and more issues in so-called qualified majority voting. And we will have to use to this European democracy being transformed because of enlargement, because of countries like Ukraine and the Balkans joining.
But as Dave Keating said, that proposal by the French president, for now off the table. Dave Keating still waiting for final approval on that candidate status for Ukraine and neighboring Moldova.
We are still waiting. I'll tell you as soon as we hear something, but this is taking surprisingly long. I think it may be because of that very raucous Western Balkans meeting this morning. I think they needed a bit of time to digest it. We don't have any indication that there's a problem here with giving the candidate status, but it is getting kind of late.
And France 24's Dave Keating will, of course, be reporting on it. Many thanks for being with us from Brussels. I want to thank Sophie Pornschlegel in Maribor, Ina Solfsun in Kyiv, Jacques Rupnik. Thank you for being with us here in the France 24 debate.